Now, y'all, please give another round of applause to Bobby DiCello, who has been fighting on the front line all over America, but especially here in Ohio. Him and his law firm, DiCello Levitt, attorney Karen Abano, we have fought for marginalized people, marginalized minorities, marginalized black people who didn't have a voice. They didn't think it robbery to help give them a voice. So thank you more than you know, Bobby DiCello. Love you, brother. Eric Gardner said, I can't breathe. George Floyd said, I can't breathe. Frank Tyson said, I can't breathe. How many more black men in America has to tell police officers I can't breathe before police actually believe these black men fighting for their last breaths on this earth? I mean, the reason we have to get justice for Frank Tyson is because it's been far too many black men and black women saying, I can't breathe. It can happen to your daughter. It can happen to your son. That's why we have to get justice for Frank Tyson.
That's right. Justice for Frank Tyson.
Y'all understand that? Before I really break down this tragedy and really break down this case, I want you all to repeat after me, especially some of you who really know this more than other Americans. It can happen to my daughter. It can happen to my son. That's why we got to get justice for Frank Tyson. It can happen to my daughter. It can happen to my son. That's why we got to get justice for Frank Tyson. Y'all stand to your feet if you really understand it can happen to your child. It can happen to my daughter. It can happen to my son. That's why we got to get justice for Frank Tyson. Eric Gardner said, I can't breathe. And the officers said, they put him on the ground and told him to quit struggling. George Floyd said, I can't breathe, Bobby.
Yes. Yes, sir.
And they said, you're talking.
That's right.
You can breathe.
Right.
Frank Tyson said, I can't breathe. And they said, you're fine. Shut the F up. And so you would think, after Eric Gardner, the police officers would be more considerate when a person says, I can't breathe. But then you come 4 years ago to George Floyd. It's hard to believe it'll be 4 years next month, May 25th. But George Floyd says, I can't breathe. And then they respond where you're talking. No consideration for him. And then after George Floyd, every police officer in America should have consideration for when a person who is handcuffed, detained, in your custody, says, I can't breathe. Everybody in America knew from watching that trial that when they say you can't breathe, you get them off their stomachs. You sit them up on their side so they can breathe. So they can simply breathe. They can extend life. Everybody should have known that now. So what those officers were thinking had to be something that we can't relate to. Anybody that saw that George Floyd video cannot relate to you ignoring a person saying, I can't breathe. That's right. You cannot understand it. How many more teachable moments, America, at the cost of black people's lives do we have to give you before you believe us when we say, I can't breathe? And then certainly, Attorney DiCello, to John, his brother, Marcus, his brother, Darren, his brother, Sabrina, his soulmate. I mean, after George Floyd, if any police officer in America knew that it was excessive force to put your knee on a person's neck who is detained, handcuffed, and face down, I don't know where you were trained at. That should be police training 101 now in America. Don't put your knee on my neck. I mean, it's simple. We have that picture, Bobby. I mean, we got the picture of his hands behind his back, and the officer got his knee on his neck. That's why Bobby said, and the family believes it's George Floyd 2.0. You got him saying, I can't breathe. You got a knee on his neck. And then you got the just lack of humanity. Yes. The inhumanity, Joseph. The complete inhumanity. I mean, they are joking. They are joking.
Having a good time.
I never thought I was going to get in a bar fight. While this man is laying on the ground dying, they are joking. And we'll share this picture with the media, but it's just a still from the video that shows Frank face down, and there's a light from the body camera or what have you that shows his knee is right there on Frank's neck.
That's what I said. Amen. Look at God.
I mean, after George Floyd, really? A knee on the neck of a person who is restrained. You got him. He ain't going nowhere.
Mr. Crump, can I just say one thing?
Please.
This is the policy, use of force policy 300 for the city of Canton.
Listen.
It doesn't mean anything. They're pretty words. And pretty words don't make good deeds. Pretty words don't matter. It's time to change your policy and the way you're training your officers.
And you all, they're going to try to convince you that Frank isn't worthy of your consideration. Because after they assassinate our person, they try to assassinate our character. They did it with Trayvon Martin. They did it with Michael Brown and Ferguson. They did it with Eric Gardner. They did it with Breonna Taylor. They did it with Tamir Rice. They did it with Jalen Walker. They did it with James Williams. They did it with Andre Hill. They did it with George Floyd. They did it with Darrell Ross.
Yes.
I mean, how many more black people do they kill and then try to assassinate their character. This is part of their playbook. This is part of their MO. So we need to make the record straight for Frank Tyson. Now, just like everybody saw the George Floyd video, we're enhancing the Frank Tyson video. We're enhancing the audio on the video. We want to make sure everybody can hear Frank saying, "I can't breathe," those 7 times, and the responses from the officers when he said, "I can't breathe." We want you all to hear when they checked this post and then how the mood changed.
Yeah.
And how they still didn't do anything. And that's on the video. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Frank came in there to that establishment, and Frank was saying, "Call the sheriff." You all watched the video, right? He kept saying, "Call the sheriff." And that's important. That's very important. And understand this, Attorney Albano, there was no commotion, there was no chaos until the Canton police officers got in that establishment. That's very important to note. Big facts. Frank said, "Get the sheriff, call the sheriff." He kept saying that. He was mortally afraid of the Canton Police Department because of not just the history of the Canton Police Department, but his personal history with the Canton Police Department. You see, Sabrina and his family knows Frank was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for 24 years. And he always pleaded his innocence every day. "I did not do this." It is the tale of many black people, especially black men in America. I'm on the Innocence Project board. I know there are at least 100,000 black men in prison today who are completely innocent. Their only crime, they were at the wrong place and had the wrong skin color. Frank Tyson was robbed of his liberty for 24 years because of a racist, uncompassionate criminal justice system. Frank had been free less than 2 weeks before he was robbed of his life from a racist criminal justice system. And I don't know, John Tyson, what is worse, the wrongful conviction or the wrongful death. I mean, Attorney DiCello and I and Cliff Jones and Attorney Fauché, Attorney Bono, we went through the transcript. We went through the transcript of him fighting for his innocence, fighting to clear his name, fighting to be exonerated. Sabrina is going to tell you when you hear from her, till his last day on this earth, he was talking about clearing his name. I mean, you have a transcript that was filed in federal court where they had evidence of the 2 young people that they say he kidnapped. They recanted. They said the prosecutors told them to lie. This is in the transcript. This is in the transcript. The state trooper who was the main person to identify him, they showed evidence based on the video recording from the vehicle that he could not have possibly identified Frank. They said he was 4 miles away. But yet, they sliced the videos in court during the criminal trial. As Frank told his family and Sabrina, right, John, to frame him. And so he said, no, when you look at these two videos apart from each other, from the police, state high patrol vehicles, you see a different story. And he pointed that out in his quest, his motion to be exonerated and released from prison.
He did.
And the courts talk, and you can read this transcript. They talk about actual innocence is not enough because you were late in filing it.
Yes.
Can you imagine that? Actual innocence doesn't matter. We don't care about the merits because, black man, you couldn't afford good legal counsel. You couldn't afford good representation at the time to file the motions on time. We just gonna look away from the actual innocence. The fact that the people who were the main people who you used to convict this man said, I was being coerced.
Yes.
I was being threatened. I was under duress. I was forced to lie. We just gonna overlook all of that. That doesn't matter. Y'all, when you think about how his liberty had been stolen from him for 24 years and he was put in a cage by the Canton Police Department,
Yes.
does everybody understand why the first thing Frank Tyson was saying in that establishment is call the sheriff. Do not call the Canton police. He was mortified because he knew they had already framed him before. He had been in prison for 24 years. He had only been out for 13 days. What did he think the Canton Police Department was going to do to him this time? That's why he was calling for the sheriff. And I tell you, Bobby DiCello, you know, Frank's worst fear, I suspect, was he feared that they were going to frame him again and put him back in prison. But they did worse than that. They didn't just steal his liberty this time, they stole his life.
There you go. That's it, Ben.
Frank Tyson. Frank Tyson. Frank Tyson.
It can happen to your daughter. It can happen to your son. That's why we have to get justice for Frank Tyson. Y'all join me. It can happen to my daughter. It can happen to my son. That's why I'm fighting for justice for Frank Tyson. It can happen to my daughter. It can happen to my son. That's why I'm fighting for justice for Frank Tyson. It can happen to my daughter. It can happen to my son.